The corridor was too quiet for a night shift. Fluorescent lights flickered above the surgical wing, casting long shadows across the polished floor. 2 armed guards stood near the restricted doors, speaking in low voices, their rifles hanging loose but ready. No alarms had sounded yet. No one had run. Inside, a patient monitor began to flatline. A nurse stepped into the hallway, calm, unhurried. She adjusted her gloves as if nothing was wrong. One of the guards glanced at her, dismissive, already turning away. "Ma'am, this area is locked down," he said. She didn't stop. Behind her, footsteps echoed. Fast, coordinated, too many to ignore now. The guards shifted, raising their weapons. Radios crackled. Someone shouted from the far end of the corridor. The nurse finally looked up. Not at the guards.
Past them.
Measuring distances.
Counting.
Then she spoke, quietly, precisely. And everything changed. They had been watching the wrong person. The hospital moved differently at night. Not slower, just quieter. Conversations were shorter. Footsteps softer. Even the machines seemed to hum with less urgency, as if aware that exhaustion had settled into every corner of the building. In the surgical wing, the lights were dimmed just enough to ease the strain on tired eyes. Monitors cast a steady glow across patient rooms. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic beneath it. At the far end of the corridor, 2 security guards stood near a restricted access door. Their posture suggested alertness, but their attention drifted. One leaned slightly against the wall, the other scrolling briefly through his phone before tucking it away again. "Nothing ever happens on these shifts," one of them muttered. The other gave a short nod. That's the point. Neither of them noticed the nurse walking toward them. She moved at a steady pace, neither rushed nor slow. A clipboard rested lightly in her hand, though she wasn't looking at it. Her eyes passed over the hallway, not idly, but deliberately. Every door, every light, every reflection in the polished floor. She stopped briefly outside room 312. Inside, a patient slept under careful monitoring. The nurse stepped in, checked the 4-line, adjusted the flow rate by a fraction, and glanced at the heart monitor. The rhythm was stable, but she watched it for a few seconds longer than necessary, listening. Then she left. Back in the corridor, a junior nurse hurried past her, arms full of supplies. "Hey," the junior said, slightly out of breath. "Do you know why the system flagged the West Wing delivery?" "They said it's delayed again." The nurse shook her head once. "No update yet. They said it was cleared an hour ago." A pause. "Then it should be here," the nurse replied calmly. The junior nurse frowned, but didn't press further. "Yeah, I guess." She moved on. The nurse remained still for a moment. Her gaze shifted, not toward the supply room, but toward the security camera mounted near the ceiling. It rotated slowly, completing its arc. Then it reset. Too quickly. Most wouldn't notice. It was a small thing. A fraction of a second out of rhythm. She continued walking. At the nurse's station, a doctor sat reviewing charts, his posture slouched with fatigue. He barely looked up as she approached. "Vitals in 305 are stable," she said. "Good," he replied, already flipping a page. "We'll reassess in the morning." She placed the chart down with quiet precision. "West Wing delivery hasn't arrived," she added. The doctor sighed. "Logistics issue. It happens." It was marked as cleared. He shrugged. "Then it'll get here eventually." She studied him for a moment, not judging, just measuring. Then she nodded and stepped away. Further down the corridor, a maintenance cart sat unattended near a side door. Its position was slightly off, angled toward the hallway instead of flush against the wall. She adjusted it without hesitation, aligning it properly before continuing. The guards near the restricted door straightened slightly as she approached, more out of habit than concern. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," one of them said, though his tone lacked urgency. She stopped just short of the door. "I know," she replied. Her voice was even, controlled. Not submissive, not assertive, just certain. The guard gestured vaguely. "Then you should head back." "Orders." She looked at the keypad beside the door. Then at the small indicator light above it. "Green." Unlocked. But they hadn't noticed. "I don't need access," she said. The guards exchanged a brief glance, unsure why she had stopped at all. "Then we're good," the second guard said with a faint smile, already losing interest. She gave a slight nod and turned away. As she walked back down the corridor, her pace remained unchanged. But her attention narrowed. The camera loop, the delayed delivery, the unlocked restricted door. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. At room 318, she paused again. Inside, an elderly patient stirred slightly, discomfort visible even in sleep. The nurse adjusted the blanket, checked the oxygen line, and lowered the light intensity by a small degree. Her movements were efficient, almost automatic. But her mind was elsewhere. Counting, timing, listening to the building itself. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. Not loudly, but firmly. Not the soft, careless push of staff. Something deliberate. She stepped back into the hallway. The guards were still talking quietly, unaware. The doctor remained at his station. The junior nurse moved between rooms, focused on her tasks. Everything appeared normal. It wasn't. The nurse looked once more toward the far end of the corridor. Then she continued her rounds. Unnoticed. For now. The rhythm of the floor should have settled by now. By this hour, patterns usually held steady. Medication rounds completed, patient vitals stabilized, staff movements predictable. Even small disruptions tended to resolve themselves quickly. Tonight, they didn't. At the nurse's station, a printer began feeding out a new set of labels. The sound was sharp in the otherwise controlled quiet. The junior nurse from earlier reached for them, scanning quickly. "That's odd," she murmured. No one responded. The nurse stepped closer, her attention shifting without urgency. "What is it?" "These are for the West Wing," the junior said. "But the system still shows the delivery hasn't arrived." The nurse glanced at the labels. Lot numbers, time stamps, authorization codes. All valid. "Who cleared it?" she asked. The junior nurse checked the screen. It just says authorized. No name attached. A small pause followed. "That's not normal, right?" the junior added, her voice lowering slightly. "No," the nurse said. "Simple. Direct." The junior nurse hesitated. "Should we report it?" The nurse didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past the station toward the corridor leading to the West Wing. Still quiet. Still empty. "Log it," she said. No escalation yet. The junior nodded, relieved to have direction, and turned back to her screen. The nurse moved on. Near the supply room, she stopped again. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to break alignment with the frame. Inside, the shelves were stocked, organized. Except for one section. A row of sealed containers sat out of sequence. Not missing. Not damaged. Just misplaced. She stepped inside. Her fingers brushed one of the containers, turning it just enough to read the label clearly. The seal was intact. The expiration date correct. But the placement was wrong. Someone had accessed the shelf. Carefully. Without leaving disorder. She returned the container to its original position, restoring the sequence precisely. Then she stepped back into the hallway and closed the door fully. Across the corridor, one of the guards shifted his weight, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. "You keep circling," he called out casually. "Everything okay?" She looked at him. "Yes." He gave a half smile. "Long night." She didn't respond. He misread the silence as fatigue and looked away. Further down, a wall-mounted screen displayed the hospital's internal camera feeds. Most showed empty corridors, patient rooms, inactive areas. The nurse slowed as she passed it. One feed caught her attention. The loading bay. A vehicle sat parked just outside the frame, only its edge visible. No movement. No personnel. She watched for a moment. The timestamp in the corner flickered. Not enough for most to notice. But it skipped, less than a second, then corrected itself. A loop. Short. Clean. Intentional. She continued walking. At the far end of the corridor, a door connected to a secondary stairwell, rarely used during night shifts. A small indicator panel beside it showed access logs. She stopped. The last entry had been minutes ago. No staff assigned to this wing should have used it. She pressed the panel lightly, bringing up the detailed log. The credentials were valid, but the ID attached to them didn't belong to anyone currently on shift. Behind her, footsteps approached quickly. "Hey," the junior nurse said, slightly breathless again. "They just tried to call Central Supply, no response." The nurse turned her head slightly. No response. Line connects, but no one answers. A brief silence settled between them. The junior nurse's confidence wavered. Maybe it's just system issues? The nurse looked back at the access panel, then at the closed stairwell door, then down the corridor, toward the guards. "Maybe," she said, but her tone didn't agree. She stepped away from the panel. "Stay near the station," she told the junior nurse. "Why?" "In case they call back." The junior nodded, accepting the explanation, though it didn't fully settle her unease. As she walked back toward the main corridor, the nurse's pace remained measured, controlled. Nothing in her posture suggested urgency, but her focus had sharpened completely now. Every sound registered, every movement mapped, every inconsistency stored. Near room 312, she paused again, not to enter this time but to listen. The building carried subtle signals. Air systems adjusting. Distant doors opening. Footsteps where there shouldn't be any. Faint. Coordinated. From more than one direction. At the restricted door, the guards were still in position, but their posture had changed slightly. One had his radio in hand now, listening. "Repeat that," he said into it. "You're cutting out." Static answered him. He frowned, tapping the device. "Control, confirm status." Nothing. The second guard shifted, unease replacing his earlier boredom. "Probably just interference." "Yeah," the first replied, though his tone lacked conviction. The nurse approached, stopping a few steps short. "Radio down?" she asked. The guard glanced at her, mildly surprised she'd noticed. "Yeah. Happens sometimes." She nodded once. "Check your secondary channel," she said. He blinked. "What?" "Secondary channel," she repeated, calm. "It's less congested." He hesitated, then adjusted the settings on his radio. A burst of clearer static came through, still broken, but stronger. "Positions, hold, repeat, hold." The transmission cut again. The guards stared at the device, now fully alert. "How did you?" She had already turned away, moving back down the corridor. The pieces were no longer separate. They were aligning. The delay, the access logs, the camera loops, the silence from Central. This wasn't a malfunction. It was preparation. At the nurse's station, the junior nurse looked up as she returned. Still nothing from supply. The nurse gave a small nod. "Continue your rounds," she said. The junior hesitated. "Is something wrong?" A pause. Then, "Not yet." The nurse picked up a chart, scanning it briefly. Around them, the hospital continued its quiet routine. Monitors beeped. Lights hummed. Footsteps echoed softly. Everything appeared controlled. But beneath the surface, something had already begun. And most of them hadn't noticed. Not yet. It started without a siren. No alarm. No announcement. No visible signal that something had shifted. Only the doors. At the far end of the surgical wing, the automatic access doors clicked once, then locked in sequence. One after another. Clean. Synchronized. As if following a preloaded command rather than reacting to an event. A nurse at the station looked up. Did the system just? The lights in the west corridor dimmed slightly. Not blackout. Not emergency red. Just a controlled reduction in brightness, like the building itself was being gently closed off from the outside world. Then the first voice came through the overhead speakers. "Attention all staff. Remain where you are. This is a controlled security procedure." The voice was calm. Too calm. The junior nurse froze. "Security procedure? We weren't told." The nurse didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were already moving, counting exits, mapping distance, measuring response time between announcement and reaction. Too fast. This wasn't a routine drill. Across the corridor, the guards near the restricted door straightened fully now. One brought his radio up instantly. "Control, confirm lockdown initiation," he said. Only static answered. The second guard frowned. That doesn't match schedule. No, the first said quietly. Then his posture changed. From relaxed to fully alert. The nurse stepped slightly closer to the wall, not obstructing anyone, but no longer blending into background motion. Her gaze followed the corridor line toward the west wing. Something had moved. Not visibly, but structurally. Far down the corridor, a maintenance door opened without sound. A man in hospital attire stepped out, head lowered, moving with purpose that didn't belong to staff fatigue or routine urgency. Then another. Not running. Not rushing. Just entering positions. The junior nurse noticed them. Who are those? The nurse interrupted softly. Don't point. The junior froze mid-motion. The guards noticed now, too. The first guard raised his radio again. We have unidentified personnel in the west corridor. Confirm authorization. Still nothing. Only static.
Then,
A second voice came through the overhead system.
different this time. Shorter.
Controlled. Secure all medical staff. Lock internal movement. The tone wasn't administrative. It was operational. The first guard swore, under his breath. That's not hospital protocol. The second guard was already moving toward the corridor. Sir, the nurse said suddenly. The guard turned slightly. She didn't raise her voice. Don't advance alone. He hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. Then continued anyway. The nurse's eyes followed him.
Not stopping him.
Just observing. At the corner of the corridor, the man in scrubs lifted his head slightly. And then the guard stopped. Not because he was told. Because 3 more figures had appeared behind the first. The corridor was no longer empty. It had been occupied. Quietly. Systematically. The junior nurse stepped back instinctively. What is happening? The nurse answered without looking at her. Containment. Containment of what?
A pause.
Then, of us. A distant metallic click echoed through the structure. Another set of doors locked. Then another. The hospital was segmenting itself, cutting its own movement into controlled zones. The guards were now fully alert, weapons no longer hanging loosely. The first guard spoke into his radio again. Faster this time. Control. We have breach level unknowns. I repeat. The transmission cut mid-sentence. Dead silence followed. No static this time. Just nothing. The second guard looked at him. We're isolated. The realization hit cleanly. No communication outward. No confirmation inward. The hospital had become self-contained. The nurse finally shifted her stance slightly, not retreating, not advancing. Just adjusting her position in relation to the changing geometry of the corridor. She was no longer standing in a passive zone. She was standing at an intersection point. Movement paths converging. The man in scrubs ahead took another step forward. Then stopped. Listening. As if waiting for confirmation from somewhere else. Not the hospital. Something beyond it. The junior nurse's breathing quickened. We should go back to the station. No, the nurse said. The word was quiet, but final. The junior stopped. For the first time, she didn't question it. Down the corridor, one of the unidentified figures lifted a hand slightly. A signal. And the system responded. Another set of doors sealed behind them, cutting off retreat paths. The guards raised their weapons fully now. But there was hesitation in their stance. Not fear yet. Uncertainty. Because no shots had been fired. No demands shouted. No visible violence. Only structure changing. The nurse looked at the locked doors behind them, then at the corridor ahead, then at the people entering it. Shift your position, she said quietly. The guard nearest her glanced over.
What?
Move left 2 steps. It wasn't an order he should have followed, but something in her tone bypassed argument. He moved. As he did, a figure from the corridor ahead stepped forward into the exact space he had just vacated. Perfect alignment. If he had stayed, he would have been in direct line of control. The guard realized it a moment later. His expression changed. He looked at her. She wasn't watching him anymore. She was watching everything. Not reacting. Calculating. The hospital was no longer neutral ground. It had become an active system of control. and someone had already understood its structure better than anyone else in the building. The corridor no longer felt like part of a hospital. It felt measured. Every light, every doorway, every gap between movement had a purpose that no one on staff had authorized. The air itself seemed divided into zones, some accessible, some silently closed off. The nurse stood near the intersection point, her position unchanged. She did not retreat with the junior nurse. She did not advance with the guards. She simply observed the flow of control tightening around them. The first of the unidentified figures stepped fully into view now. He wore hospital scrubs, but his posture betrayed him immediately. Not the posture of medical staff. Not fatigue. Not routine urgency. There was structure in how he stood. Weight distributed evenly, head aligned, hands free but ready. He wasn't alone anymore. Behind him, two more emerged from side access points that should have been locked. The guard nearest the restricted door raised his weapon slightly. "Stop right there." The man didn't stop. He looked past the guard, not at him, through him, as if confirming positions further down the corridor. The second guard spoke into his radio again, voice sharper now. "We have hostile presence confirmed. Request immediate backup." Still nothing. No response. No static. Just absence. The silence from command was no longer technical. It was intentional. The junior nurse moved closer to the wall instinctively. "Why isn't anyone answering?" The nurse finally responded, still watching forward. "Because no one is listening." A beat of silence followed that statement. Not fear. Understanding beginning to form. The first unidentified man took another step forward.
Slow.
Measured. The guard tightened his grip on his weapon. "This is a secured medical facility. Identify yourself." The man finally spoke. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just clearly. "Controlled transfer is active." The guard frowned. That's not a valid authorization phrase. No reaction. Only continuation. Behind him, more movement appeared at the far end of the corridor. Additional figures entering from stairwell access points. From service corridors. From places that should have required clearance. They were not rushing. They were closing geometry. The nurse's eyes tracked the formation quietly. She did not look surprised. Only precise. The junior nurse whispered, "What does that mean?" The nurse answered, "It means the hospital is no longer operating under its original command structure." The words landed heavier than expected. The second guard shifted slightly. "That's not possible. No one can override internal hospital security without central." He stopped mid-sentence. Because he already knew what he was going to say next didn't matter. The system had already failed to respond. The first unidentified man raised his hand slightly again. Not a threat gesture. A coordination signal. And the corridor responded. Doors behind the guards clicked. Locking. Not unlocking. Locking them forward. The guards turned instinctively. Realization arriving late. They had been separated from fallback positions. Not trapped by force. Trapped by design. The nurse watched this shift without moving. Then spoke quietly. "Don't fire." Both guards looked at her immediately.
"What?" one of them snapped.
"Do not fire unless you confirm identity," she repeated. The tone wasn't emotional. It was procedural. That made it harder to dismiss. The second guard hesitated. "You don't understand what this is." "I do," she said. A pause. That was the first moment in which neither guard had an immediate response. Not because she raised her voice. Because she sounded certain. Down the corridor, the unidentified group stopped advancing. They were now at optimal distance. Not too close. Not too far. The nurse noticed that too. She finally turned her head slightly toward them. The lead figure met her gaze. Just for a moment. Then he spoke again. "Medical personnel to be contained and observed. No escalation unless resistance is confirmed."
Contained.
Not eliminated. Not attacked. Controlled. The junior nurse's breath hitched. "We're being contained?" The nurse didn't answer immediately, because she was already noticing something else. The formation wasn't random. It was structured around response zones. They weren't just occupying space. They were anticipating reaction paths. The guards were still the only visible armed resistance. But they were not the center of this system. They were variables inside it. The first guard stepped forward half a step. "Stand down," he ordered again, louder this time. The lead figure finally looked directly at him. Not hostile, not afraid, just evaluating. Then, "You are not command authority," he said. The words were calm, final. The second guard's radio crackled suddenly. Once. Then a burst of partial signal. "Repeat, external authorization confirmed." The guard froze. "What?" The radio continued. "Stand by for priority directive." Silence followed. Then the speaker system in the ceiling activated again. But this time, it was not the earlier calm voice. It was different.
Clearer.
Structured. Official. Security protocol override acknowledged. The corridor seemed to tighten at that moment. Not physically, but operationally. The guards looked at each other. For the first time, uncertainty became visible in their stance. The nurse remained still, but her attention had sharpened further, because now she understood the shift. This was no longer an intrusion. It was an authority transition in progress. And the system had already begun obeying the wrong command chain. The corridor had changed its language. Not in sound, but in structure. Every movement now carried consequence. Every step forward altered spacing. Every pause reshaped control lines. What had begun as confusion was now settling into a deliberate architecture of containment. The nurse recognized it first in silence. Not fear. Pattern recognition. She stood slightly behind the guards now, but not sheltered by them. Her position had shifted subtly over time, always adjusting to maintain visibility of exits, angles, and movement lanes. She was no longer reacting to the situation.
She was reading it.
The lead unidentified figure had stopped advancing. He was no longer testing distance. Instead, he stood with his team distributed across the corridor in measured positions. Each placement had purpose. Each gap had intention. The second guard lowered his weapon slightly, not in surrender, but in uncertainty. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We should have backup by now." No one responded, because everyone already understood the answer forming silently in the system. There would be no backup. The nurse looked toward the ceiling speaker, then toward the security camera at the far corner. It was still active, still recording, still feeding somewhere, but not outward, inward. She stepped slightly to the side. The junior nurse followed her instinctively. "Where are you going?" "Not moving," the nurse replied. She paused, then corrected herself. Positioning. The word unsettled the junior nurse more than it should have. Behind them, one of the guards spoke into his radio again, but this time with less force. "Control, confirm jurisdiction authority. We are requesting identification of override source." A pause. Then static. But not empty static. Structured static. As if something was trying to resolve language through interference. The nurse's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't failure. That was filtering. She looked back toward the corridor. The lead figure shifted his stance slightly, adjusting weight distribution. A small gesture, but enough to signal internal communication had just occurred. The system was not frozen. It was negotiating itself. The second guard noticed her attention. "You see something?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the movement pattern ahead. 3 figures on the left corridor edge. 2 near the stairwell entry. 1 at the rear ceiling point. They were not rushing. They were stabilizing control zones. Finally, she spoke. "They're not advancing," she said. The first guard frowned. "Then what are they doing?" "Locking response options." The words were simple, but neither guard responded immediately, because they didn't fully understand them, but instinctively felt their accuracy. The nurse stepped closer to the wall, now fully integrating herself into the geometry of the corridor. She was no longer in the center of attention, but she was in the center of structure. Her gaze tracked timing intervals, door lock cycles, camera rotation patterns, radio signal decay. Everything had rhythm. Everything had been synchronized, not by the hospital, by something inside it, or through it. The junior nurse whispered, "This feels like military." The nurse didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either. Just said, "It's organized." That distinction mattered more than the junior realized. A sudden movement at the far end of the corridor tightened attention instantly. One of the unidentified figures raised a hand slightly. The entire formation paused, not in fear, in coordination. Then the speaker system activated again. Medical containment remains priority. Maintain non-lethal control parameters. The phrase was clinical,
Detached.
like a system describing its own function. The second guard looked increasingly uneasy now. Non-lethal control parameters? Who the hell are they? The nurse answered quietly. People who already understand how this building operates. That statement shifted something in the air, because it implied familiarity. Not invasion. Integration. The lead figure took one step forward again, then stopped. He was not pressing anymore. He was waiting. For alignment. The nurse noticed that too. They were not trying to overwhelm resistance. They were waiting for resistance to resolve itself. She studied the pattern again, and then something clicked into place. Access points were not being breached. They were being synchronized. The hospital wasn't being broken into. It was being taken over through its own systems. She exhaled slowly. Controlled. The first guard finally turned slightly toward her. "You're not reacting like the rest of them," he said. It wasn't accusation. It was observation. She met his gaze briefly. "I'm observing," she replied. A pause. Then she added, "That's the difference." The corridor remained tense, but no longer chaotic. It had become structured tension. The unidentified figures held position. The guards held theirs. And between them, the nurse stood in a space that no one had yet defined as belonging to either side. Because she was not interpreting the situation as conflict. She was interpreting it as a system transition. And she had already begun calculating what would happen when that transition completed. The corridor was no longer reacting randomly. It was responding. Every sound, every movement, every hesitation was being absorbed into a structure that was tightening by seconds, not minutes. The hospital had stopped feeling like a place and started behaving like a controlled field. The nurse noticed the change in pressure first. Not physical pressure. Operational. The kind that comes when decision paths start narrowing. The guards were still positioned near her, but their authority had begun to fracture. Their radios were unreliable. Their commands no longer carried outward confirmation. Even their presence felt less like control and more like resistance inside a system that had already moved past them. The junior nurse stayed slightly behind her now, no longer asking questions. She was simply watching, learning fear in real time. At the far end of the corridor, the unidentified formation had stabilized completely. No further advance. No retreat. Only containment positioning. They were waiting, not for resistance to break, but for compliance to emerge. That distinction mattered. The first guard finally spoke again, voice tighter now. "I need clear identification from all personnel in that corridor." No response came immediately. Then the speaker system activated again. "Continue containment protocol." The same tone. The same detachment. The guard clenched his jaw. That's not an answer.
But it was.
Just not one he could challenge directly. The nurse stepped forward slightly. Not into confrontation. Into visibility. Both guards noticed immediately. "Where are you going?" one of them asked sharply. "Forward," she replied. No one authorized movement past this point.
She stopped.
Looked at him. And for the first time, she didn't defer. "I am not asking for authorization," she said. The corridor seemed to tighten again at those words. Not because they were loud. Because they were structurally wrong in this environment. The second guard reacted immediately. "You can't just," she interrupted gently. "Your communication lines are compromised." Silence followed. Not disbelief. Recognition forming unwillingly. She continued, still calm. "Your command confirmation loop has failed. Your backup channels are filtered. And your containment protocol is already active without your input." Each sentence reduced resistance. Not through force. Through clarity. The first guard stared at her. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past them. At the formation ahead. At the spacing. At the timing of movement pauses. Then back to him. Because I can see it, she said simply. That answer should have sounded vague. It didn't. It sounded accurate. The junior nurse whispered, "You shouldn't be saying that." But no one was listening to her anymore. The lead unidentified figure tilted his head slightly. A subtle signal passed through his formation. The nurse noticed it instantly. They were reacting to her now. Not the guards. Her. The first guard raised his voice slightly. "Step back. That's an order." She did not move back. But she did something else. She adjusted position by half a step. Not toward him.
Not toward them.
Toward alignment. And that small shift changed the geometry of the corridor again. The unidentified formation paused. The guards noticed that pause too. A hesitation they did not cause. The nurse spoke again, quieter this time. "If you continue escalation without confirmation, you will lose control of this wing within 3 minutes." The first guard frowned. "That's not possible."
She didn't argue.
She simply continued. "Your containment system is built on central synchronization. Central is already suppressed. That means your local authority is now reactive, not directive." The words landed heavier than intended, because they weren't theoretical. They were descriptive. The second guard looked uneasy now. "You're saying this is coordinated from inside the hospital?" She paused, then corrected him softly. "I'm saying it already is." A long silence followed. Not dramatic. Just realization forming in layers. The unidentified formation ahead shifted again. Not forward. Not backward. Just rebalancing. As if adjusting to a new variable in the system. The nurse's presence. The first guard lowered his weapon slightly. Not fully, but enough to signal internal conflict. "You're not security," he said quietly. She met his gaze. "No," she replied. Another pause. Then she added, without emotion, "I never was." That statement changed something. Not loudly, but structurally. Because it confirmed what they had started to suspect, but could not verify. The system around them was no longer behaving as a hospital security failure. It was behaving as a controlled operation. And she was not reacting like a civilian caught in it. She was reacting like someone who understood its design. The junior nurse finally spoke again, voice small. "Then what are you?" The corridor fell quiet enough to hear distant mechanical clicks of door locks cycling deeper in the building. The nurse didn't answer immediately, because she wasn't offering identity. She was assessing consequence. "Finally," she said, "I'm the one telling you where it ends." The unidentified formation did not move. But their stillness changed. It became attentive. The guards did not respond, because they no longer had a clear framework for response. And for the first time since the lockdown began, the system did not feel like it was closing around them. It felt like it was waiting for her next instruction without realizing it had started doing so. The hospital silence was no longer passive. It was enforced. Doors that had once been passageways were now fixed points of restriction. Elevators sat frozen between floors. Even the ventilation hum felt regulated, like the building had reduced itself to essential function only. Inside that controlled stillness, every decision carried weight. The nurse understood that before anyone else did. At the far end of the corridor, the unidentified formation remained steady. No advance. No retreat. They were no longer probing the space. They were holding it, waiting for confirmation that never came from the original command structure. The guards near her were changing now. Not physically. Internally. The first guard kept his weapon lowered slightly, not fully trusting the situation anymore. The second guard kept glancing toward his radio, as if it might suddenly restore meaning to itself. It didn't. The junior nurse stood closer to the wall, hands clenched lightly, trying not to look at the corridor ahead too directly. Because looking too long made it real. A distant sound echoed through the hospital structure. Not loud, but sharp enough to cut through controlled silence. A crash, somewhere deeper in the surgical wing. Then a brief burst of movement over radios that no one in this corridor could properly receive. The second guard spoke quietly. "That's not here." The nurse responded without turning her head. "It's adjacent containment failure." The guard frowned. "What does that mean?" She finally looked at him. "It means another section just lost control of patient movement." That sentence changed the air slightly, because it introduced consequence beyond their immediate corridor. The system was not static. It was spreading. The unidentified formation ahead shifted again. A subtle repositioning, tightening their control lanes. They had heard it too. The nurse noticed. She stepped forward half a step. Immediately, both guards reacted. "Stop," the first guard said, sharper now. "You're not moving further."
She paused.
Looked at the corridor. Then at the monitors mounted along the wall, patient feeds, system logs, access indicators. One of them flickered. Not failure.
Update.
She spoke quietly. "There is a patient in surgical room 4B on ventilatory support." The junior nurse blinked. "Yes, critical post-op." The nurse nodded slightly. "And that room is now within the containment boundary shift zone." The junior nurse's face tightened. "What does that mean?" The nurse didn't answer immediately, because she was already calculating. Then she said, "It means their movement restriction just reached medical necessity threshold." The first guard frowned. "Speak plainly."
She did.
"If no one intervenes, the system will prioritize containment over care." A pause followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The second guard finally said, "That's not how hospital protocol works." She turned toward him. "Not anymore." That sentence landed harder than any alarm could have, because it implied a shift in governing logic. Not breach. Replacement. A brief sound came through the corridor again, this time from deeper within the system. A metallic confirmation tone from sealed doors locking further sections. The nurse's attention sharpened. She made a decision. Without hesitation. "I need access to surgical wing bypass." The first guard immediately shook his head. Denied. She didn't argue. Instead, she pointed slightly toward the wall-mounted panel. "You already have partial override capability on secondary maintenance access." The guard hesitated. "That's restricted." "Everything is restricted," she replied calmly. A pause. The second guard stepped forward slightly. "Even if we tried, we don't have authorization confirmation." She looked at him directly. "You won't get confirmation." Silence. The junior nurse spoke softly. "If you go there, it's inside the lockdown zone." The nurse nodded. Yes. That was the first time she acknowledged personal risk in the situation. Not dramatically, just factually. The corridor behind them shifted again. Doors locking deeper. Movement, containment tightening. The unidentified formation did not advance, but their posture had changed. They were no longer waiting passively. They were adjusting to her intent. The first guard lowered his weapon slightly more. "Why would you go in there alone?" She looked at him for a long moment, then answered, "Because no one else can interpret it fast enough." That wasn't arrogance. It was assessment. The kind that comes from understanding time constraints in systems where delay equals loss. The second guard hesitated. "You're not cleared for that zone." She turned slightly toward the corridor. "I was never cleared for this one either." That silence afterward was different. Heavier. Because no one could refute it. She stepped forward. This time, neither guard immediately stopped her. Not because they agreed, but because they no longer understood what authority applied. The junior nurse reached out slightly, then stopped herself. "Wait." The nurse paused. Did not turn fully. Only enough to acknowledge. "Stay here," she said softly. The junior nurse's voice tightened. "If something happens," the nurse cut her off gently. "Nothing happens if containment holds." Then, after a brief pause. "And it will." She moved. The corridor ahead subtly adjusted as she advanced. Not blocking her. Not clearing her. Aligning around her path. The unidentified formation shifted again, this time splitting slightly, creating a controlled passage. Not surrender. Recognition of movement within system logic. The guards watched her go. The first guard finally spoke quietly. "She's not just reacting to this." The second guard finished the thought. "She understands it." The nurse continued forward alone now, passing into the edge of containment geometry, where the hospital stopped being a place of care and became a structure of control operating without permission from those still inside it. The surgical wing felt colder, not in temperature, but in intent. Every door she passed was now part of a controlled lattice. Access points no longer behaved like hospital infrastructure. They behaved like decisions already made. The nurse moved through it without hesitation, not because it was safe, because it was readable. Behind her, the corridor she left remained active. The guards were still there, still trying to re-establish communication that no longer responded in any meaningful way. The junior nurse stayed near them, frozen between obedience and disbelief. Ahead of her, the containment zone expanded. This was no longer a corridor. It was a system interior, and she was inside its operating layer. A faint sound echoed through the structure. Not alarms, not shouting, mechanical confirmations. Locks engaging in sequence across multiple floors. The hospital was completing its own segmentation. She stopped briefly near a junction where 3 corridors met.
Paused.
Looked up. The cameras above her rotated. Slightly too smooth. Too synchronized. She exhaled once. Then continued. At the far end of the wing, the situation had changed again. A secondary cluster of unidentified personnel stood near surgical access doors. Their positions were tighter now, more defensive than before. Not because they feared resistance, but because something in the system had become unstable. Her presence. She stepped into view. No announcement. No confrontation. Just arrival. The nearest figure turned slightly. Assessing. Waiting. The nurse did not stop. She approached until she was within speaking distance of the control point, where surgical access, patient flow, and containment boundaries intersected. The lead figure from earlier was not here. This group was different. Operational layer, not field layer. One of them spoke first. Medical personnel are to remain outside active control corridor. Her eyes moved briefly across the panel beside him, then the sealed doors, then the status indicators. All zones are active, she said calmly. The man frowned. You are not authorized to interpret system state. She looked at him. I don't need authorization to observe it. A pause followed. Behind her, the building shifted again. Another set of locks engaging somewhere deeper. The system was tightening its final structure. The man gestured slightly. Return to designated medical safe area. She didn't move. Instead, she stepped closer to the control interface. Her hand hovered briefly near the panel. Not touching, just reading. The man's tone sharpened. Do not interfere. Her response was immediate. I'm not interfering.
A beat.
I'm correcting drift. That sentence changed the tension in the space, because it implied she understood the system's intended function versus its current deviation. Another figure stepped forward slightly. Explain. She finally turned fully toward them. Not aggressive. Not submissive. Exact. You've lost synchronization with central command validation, she said. That means your containment logic is now operating on partial authority loops. The men exchanged a glance. She continued. The hospital is no longer executing unified protocol. It's executing fragmented control states. A pause. Then she added quietly. And those states are about to conflict. Almost immediately, a distant mechanical sound echoed through the wing. Not loud, but layered. Multiple systems attempting simultaneous lock coordination. The building responded to itself. Incorrectly. The control panel beside her flickered. Once. Then twice. The man nearest her stiffened slightly. That shouldn't be happening. She nodded once. It is. A deeper sound followed, this time from multiple floors. Doors locking out of sequence. Then unlocking. Then relocking again. The system was cycling. Failing to stabilize. The nurse stepped closer to the interface. This time, no one stopped her immediately. Not because they allowed it. Because they were watching what she saw. Her fingers finally touched the panel. Not forcefully. Precisely. She navigated the interface without hesitation. Not guessing. Not exploring. Executing. The man's voice tightened. You are not system control staff. She didn't look at him. I don't need to be. A brief pause. Then, she initiated a manual freeze command sequence. Not a shutdown. Not an override. A stabilization halt. The panel flashed red for a fraction of a second, then recalculated. The system resisted. For the first time. Not through security protocols. Through internal contradiction. The building itself hesitated. Doors mid-cycle stopped. Elevators paused between floors. Lock sequences suspended. Not released. Frozen. The corridor outside fell into sudden stillness. Even the distant mechanical sound stopped resolving. The entire wing entered a suspended state. The man stared at the panel. What did you just do? She finally looked at him. I stopped it from completing a contradictory cycle. A pause. Then she added quietly. Any further execution would have collapsed patient safety parameters. Silence followed. Not disbelief anymore. Recalibration. The system had frozen. Not defeated. Held. Outside, somewhere in the hospital, distant voices attempted communication over broken channels. But nothing responded. The nurse stepped back from the panel. The operation was no longer advancing. It was paused at its most unstable point. And everyone in the building had just realized she was the reason it hadn't collapsed completely. The hospital did not feel frozen anymore. It felt held. Not by systems. Not by protocol. By interruption. Every corridor, every sealed door, every suspended elevator existed in a state that should not have been stable but was. The entire surgical wing sat between execution and collapse, locked in a controlled pause that no one inside had the authority to initiate, except it had already been initiated and maintained. The nurse stood a few steps back from the control panel. She was no longer interacting with it. She was observing its stability. Around her, the operational personnel had changed posture. Not relaxed, nothing here allowed relaxation, but recalibrated. Their urgency had shifted into evaluation. The man closest to her spoke again, but his tone was no longer assertive. Manual freeze like that requires central verification. She nodded slightly.
It would, she said. A pause.
Then added, if central were functional. Silence followed, because no one could confidently confirm that it was. A faint vibration passed through the structure, subtle but noticeable. Not movement. Attempted movement. The system trying to resume. Failing. Reattempting. Failing again. The nurse watched it carefully, then spoke almost to herself. It's stabilizing in cycles. The man frowned. Explain. She gestured slightly toward the control interface. It's trying to reconcile 3 conflicting command sources. Local security, internal override, and external interruption. She paused, then continued. And none of them are fully complete. The phrase external interruption hung in the air longer than the others, because no one had formally identified what that meant yet. At that moment, a distant sound echoed through the building. Not alarms. Not mechanical. Footsteps. Coordinated. Approaching through secured access points that were no longer actively controlling entry. Then, a shift in the corridor lighting. Subtle, but deliberate. The man nearest her turned his head slightly. We have incoming external presence. No one had needed to announce it. They could feel it. The system was reacting to something outside its current frozen state. The nurse didn't move. She already knew. The stabilization she had initiated wasn't isolated. It had triggered visibility. At the far end of the wing, doors that had been sealed began to cycle again. But differently this time. Not reopening fully. Not locking tighter. Transitioning. The building was attempting recovery. The man beside her stepped slightly back. This is above facility level response. She nodded once. Yes. Another pause. Then, footsteps reached the edge of visual range. Uniformed personnel. Not hospital staff. Not unidentified intruders. Something else. Structured authority. They moved with confirmation discipline, not uncertainty. Their presence didn't disrupt the frozen system. It integrated with it. One of them stopped near the control boundary, looked at the panel, then at her. No surprise. No confusion. Only recognition of state. The man beside her whispered, "They're not ours." She replied quietly, "They are now involved." The arriving figure spoke into a handheld device briefly.
Short.
Controlled. then nodded once. Immediately, the building systems responded, not fully releasing, but aligning. The frozen state began to resolve into managed control, not chaos, not continuation. Stabilized handover. The nurse observed the shift carefully. She did not step forward. She did not step back. She simply watched as authority transitioned from internal fragmented systems into external coordinated command presence. And none of it required explanation, because it was already understood by the system itself. The man beside her finally asked quieter now, "Who authorized this?" She looked at the incoming personnel, then answered, "Not the hospital."
A pause.
"And not us." The arriving authority began issuing controlled directives into the system interface. Doors unlocked in specific sequences. Patient pathways were restored selectively. Critical care zones were prioritized without breaking containment stability. It was precise.
Contained.
Repaired rather than overridden. The nurse exhaled slowly. The pressure in the system reduced but did not disappear, because something else remained unchanged. She was still the reference point that had stopped the collapse. One of the arriving personnel approached her position, paused a few steps away, gave a brief, formal nod. Not ceremonial. Acknowledged, then spoke only one line. Containment stabilization confirmed. No praise. No explanation. Just status validation. The nurse responded with a small nod. Nothing more. The man beside her looked between them, realization forming slowly in his expression. "You weren't improvising," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "I was preventing failure," she replied. Outside the surgical wing, systems continued restoring controlled functionality. But within this space, the recognition had already settled. Not of identity, of capability. And that was all the acknowledgement she allowed. The hospital began to breathe again, but differently than before. Not fully restored. Not fully disrupted. Something in between, carefully stitched back together by external coordination and internal restraint. Lights stabilized across the surgical wing. Doors resumed controlled function. Monitors returned to predictable rhythms. But the atmosphere had changed permanently. Not louder. Heavier. The nurse stood near the edge of the control corridor as systems completed their final stabilization sequences. The arriving personnel had already begun moving deeper into the facility, guiding restoration protocols with quiet efficiency. No celebration followed. No announcement of resolution. Only structured recovery. Around her, the guards who had once held authority in the corridor remained still for a moment longer than necessary. One of them lowered his weapon fully now, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement that the situation no longer required his input. The second guard exhaled slowly. That was not a normal incident. The first didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly. "No," he agreed. The junior nurse stood farther back now, still processing everything that had unfolded. Her eyes kept shifting between the restored corridor and the nurse who had never once raised her voice. Finally, she asked softly, "Who are you?" The question wasn't repeated for confirmation. It was asked because it could no longer be avoided. The nurse didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down the corridor one last time. At the sealed doors now functioning normally again. At the control panels returning to standard status. At the hospital pretending, once more, to be just a hospital. Then she said, "Someone who understands systems when they fail." A pause followed. Not satisfying, but final. The junior nurse nodded slowly, though it was clear she didn't fully grasp it. And maybe she wasn't meant to. A distant announcement finally came through the overhead speakers.
Calm.
Official. Lockdown resolved. Resume standard medical operations. No mention of cause. No mention of transition. No mention of her. Just return. As if nothing had happened. The guards exchanged a brief look, then stepped aside, allowing normal flow to begin again. But no one moved immediately, because normal no longer felt immediate. It had to be re-entered carefully. The nurse adjusted her gloves. The same motion as before. Routine. Controlled. Familiar. Then she turned slightly toward the junior nurse. "Go back to your station," she said gently. The junior hesitated. And you? A brief pause. Then the nurse replied, I continue my shift. No emphasis. No weight added. Just fact. The junior nurse nodded, slowly backing away, still looking unsure whether anything had truly ended or simply been paused in a way no one fully understood. The corridor gradually filled again with movement, staff returning, voices lowering, systems resuming their ordinary rhythm. But something remained unchanged: the awareness that beneath the routine structure of a hospital, systems could shift.
Control could fragment.
And silence could become operational. The nurse walked back toward the main wing. Not escorted, not followed, just integrated once again into the flow of staff movement. A nurse among nurses. Nothing more visible than before, but no longer unseen. At the far end of the corridor, one of the external personnel briefly observed her from a distance. A short nod was given again. Acknowledgement. Then they turned away. No spotlight remained on her. No record was announced. No distinction made. And that was exactly how she preferred it. The hospital continued its night shift. Monitors beeped steadily. Footsteps softened. Orders returned to normal cadence. But somewhere in the structure of the building, something had been permanently adjusted. Not repaired. Not erased. Understood. And the nurse continued walking through it. Quietly, precisely, as if nothing had ever interrupted the night at all.